Welcome to Social Psychology. I'm Ryan Keith. So far this semester, at least in class, we've talked a lot about the fact that everybody's terrible. And today, I want to talk to you outside of the classroom, coming live from my backyard, about why it's not surprising and maybe not terrible that everybody's terrible. For example, we all know that stereotyping, racism, discrimination, these things are wrong. And on a near universal level, we all agree that it's a bad thing to do. And yet, even today, we still see nearly universal prevalence of stereotyping in our everyday lives. People doing things that are bad and sometimes doing things that they don't realize are bad. Well, I want to talk today about why it is that it makes sense, in some ways, that we do things like stereotype. We're going to talk about a cognitive explanation for why, a motivational reason for why, an economic perspective on why it is we stereotype, and lastly, some stuff about evolutionary theory and how it explains stereotyping, discrimination, and why these things are so rampant. Now, one of the first reasons we can explain stereotyping, or one of the first ways we can explain it, is through a cognitive perspective, saying that it simply makes sense, or rather helps the world make sense to stereotype people. I mean, after all, this world is filled with 7 billion people, impossible numbers of people to try to understand if you were to approach it saying that every person is an individual and needs to be understood as an individual. Because this, if we use stereotyping as a tool, a way to say that two people who are similar in some small way must be similar in lots of other ways, it makes for a world that's a lot more predictable and a lot more understandable. Now, there are a lot of times that we see stereotyping in a bad way, that we assume lots of people from other groups are bad. And even in that, it makes a lot of sense when we consider from a cognitive perspective. We tend to, as humans, make use of something called an in-group bias. We prefer people who look like us. We prefer people from our groups as opposed to people we perceive being outside of our groups. And we tend to suffer from the use of something called out-group homogeneity. Out-group homogeneity means that we assume that everybody from other groups are similar, whereas everybody from our group is unique, an individual. So it's to think about people from Santa Fe. Of course, we know that Santa Fe students are all excellent students, but we also know that if a Santa Fe student does something wrong, they must have a good individual reason for doing that. If, in contrast, we were to think about a school like the College of Central Florida, well, we know they're all a bunch of losers who do bad things all the time, and if they do something bad, there's no excuse for it. If these sorts of ideas sound familiar, that's because they're kind of like group-level examples of things that we do on the individual level. You should remember the self-serving attributional bias, that we assume that when we do things that are wrong, there's a situational explanation for it, but when somebody else does something that's wrong, it's their fault. This is like the fundamental attribution error, or the actor-observer bias. The actor-observer bias actually helps explain a lot of this cognitive perspective. Frankly, we see ourselves and people in our groups, people who are like us, a lot more than we see people who are from outside of our groups. As a result, we see lots of the specific situations, lots of the individual personality traits that explain people's behavior. And when it comes to somebody outside of our group, we don't see exactly those same kinds of traits, those same explanations. We only see a little bit of them. And falling back on salient details, falling back on our tendency to use the representational bias or the representativeness heuristic, we think of the most extreme versions of people outside of our groups and try to explain others' behaviors based on that. Now, if this sounds a little bit motivational, that's because it is. That we like to think of people in our groups, like us, as better than we really are, and think of people outside of our groups as worse than they really are. Like when we talked about the minimal group paradigm in class, it doesn't take a whole lot to form people into groups. You can tell people you're doing it, place them in groups based on random numbers, no criteria whatsoever, and they will come to believe that these groups are natural, that they're meant to be, and that the people who belong to their group are better than others, and people from outside the group are worse. And this can be explained from this motivational perspective, this desire to see ourselves as better than we really are. After all, if we fall back on social identity theory, this idea that we derive a portion of our identity from the groups to which we belong, it would make sense then that to feel good about ourselves, we would do things that make us feel good about our groups and the groups to which we belong. Now, if you remember the self-evaluation maintenance model, the idea of the self-evaluation maintenance model is that we will do things to maintain our positive self-evaluations, even if that means taking somebody else down a peg. What that means, if we take it up to the group level, is that we have a few options about feeling good. We can boost the status of our in-group. That's like deciding that your football team or your college or your political party is better than any other one, and thinking of examples of times in which people from your group have done good things. We can also denigrate the out-group. Denigrating the out-group is just the opposite. We tend to dismiss, make fun of, dehumanize, and treat poorly people from other groups. Now, part of that is to form a sense of identity that we belong to this group for good reason, but it's also because if people from outside of our group are doing poorly, we didn't have to do anything at all. We end up feeling better because in comparison, we're doing a better job. Last but not least, we can end up feeling good by basking in reflected glory. You don't play football. You don't play baseball, you don't play hockey, you don't play soccer or rugby, but when somebody from a team that you're rooting for scores a point or scores a touchdown or makes a basket or makes a run, you feel good about it as if you yourself did that. You've got a connection in terms of identity to that group you identify with, and when they do well, you can bask in that reflected glory and feel good. One of the things this would predict, this idea of our identity and feeling good about this identity, is when it is we would tend to stereotype and denigrate the outgroup. If you're making lots of downward social comparisons, if you come from a background or you're part of a group that's doing really, really well, there's not much of a motivational incentive to take someone else down a peg. After all, you're already doing well. But the economic perspective, that one where we want to get as much as possible for as little investment as possible, helps explain when it is we would do these things. When resources are scarce, the same way that animals in the wilderness when they're starving, or people who don't have a lot of money need to compete for resources, when resources are scarce, we are more likely to stereotype and do the bad things that come along with stereotyping. Of course, as always, it doesn't really matter if resources are scarce or not. What really matters is how we perceive them. If we think we're getting paid less than somebody else in another department, if you think you're not getting the same opportunities as someone in another class, if you feel that your football team was unfairly I want to say, refereed, then you feel like someone has been wronged in your group, and you're going to use whatever means necessary, including denigrating the out-group and boosting the status of the in-group to feel better. And the last thing we need to consider is that these things that we do are totally natural. And this is where we can talk about the evolutionary perspective, that even if stereotyping doesn't make sense today, in some ways it made sense for our ancestors to be doing these things. Remember that 50,000 years ago, resources were very, very scarce. And so we needed to compete with other groups that weren't related to us, that didn't look like us, in order to get those resources. We didn't have any trouble going to war against other tribes, against other groups, because there were only so many wildebeest we could hunt. There were only so many watering holes. There was only so much relative safety to go around, and we needed to do whatever we could to get our groups, especially family groups, to be successful. You should pick up some of this same evolutionary stuff in that same general psychology lecture that I'm posting to you guys, but we talk about it even more in social psychology. This idea that other groups tend not to be related to us, evolutionarily speaking, and so then we tend to reject those groups. We assume they're all the same, and that especially they're all bad. Specifically, this stuff helps explain some of the race issues that pop up when we talk about stereotyping. That humans in general tend to be xenophobic or xenophobic. We are afraid of things that we're not familiar with, and specifically, we tend to be afraid of things that are different from us. And we also, like with the similarity attraction hypothesis, prefer things that are similar to us. 50,000 years ago, your social group would look just like you because they're your family. And if you came across somebody who didn't look like you, it would make sense that you should be concerned, that you should be skeptical, that you should be suspicious of these people you don't know, of these people who look very different from you, because they come from somewhere else, and at best, they need food, they need water, they need shelter to survive, and you don't have any of that extra, and at worst, they're the reason you need that shelter, they're the reason you need that safety, because they have come to kill you, take your resources, and take your mates. Stay tuned for the next lecture, also coming from my backyard, and I appreciate you sticking with me, my shaky camera, and my homemade selfie stick. If you have any questions about this lecture or the following ones, get in touch, let me know, and I'll look forward to seeing you in class.